So we have now the pleasure to listen to Brian BERGEN-AURAND, who is assistant professor in the School of Humanities and Social Sciences in Nanyang University. Is it correct, Nanyang?
Nanyang Technological.
Nanyang Technological University. It is in Singapore. He earned his PhD in comparative literature from the University of Maryland in 2004. And he is now completing a book entitled Cinematic Provocations, Ethics, Justice, and the Body. And his primary research interests include comparative studies, film theory and criticism, ethics and embodiment. And last but not least, he is a board member of NALS, the sister association, the American Sister Association of CIREL. Please, Brian.
Yeah, thank you. Merci beaucoup. That's it. I want to thank Flora and Nelson and everyone for inviting me, and I contemplated this over and over again, and I said, I don't speak French, and she said, that's okay. And I wrote her back and said again, I don't speak French, and she said, that's okay. So I do appreciate this greatly. One of the projects I've been working on since 2009 is a book on Levinas and comedy. And this book has been going through 2009, 6 years now. There are about 10 of us involved in the project, and we've been asked over and over again, can you do this? Levinas is not funny. And I said, that's the point. And that we need to take comedy seriously. And we also do need to look at where Levinas has talked about comedy in the few sparse passages. And what's funny is the first reaction was there's nothing in Levinas. And then a year later, after the group of us had worked on it, we found 4 or 5 passages that were fruitful. The next year we found another passage. The next year we found another passage. Eventually, we're turning him into an entire collection of anecdotes on comedy and humor and laughter. And we're working through the book right now. This paper that I'm going to present is the 3rd version of my contribution to the collection. And it changes every 6 months because we get feedback and recommendations and changes. And we argue amongst ourselves as to exactly where we want to go. In part, I'm the editor of the collection, and my essay is a response to what I think is wrong with all of the contributors' essays. So this is what's been kind of fun about the arguing back and forth. And they say they like working with me, so I keep arguing that they're all wrong. So I begin with 2 quotes, and there are many other quotes. There's a secondary page as well, but I'm going to begin with these 2 quotes just to sort of set the table. I'm also going to skip because the paper is much too long. It is the chapter as it sits, so I'm going to skip a few places that are mostly background material. Oh, and one last thing. I engage with Simon Critchley's book and essay on humor quite a bit because he had kind of summarized things up to the point that I had first written this. Mostly I'm going to skip him as I work through to what I really want to get to today. So I'll be skipping mostly from the 2nd section. Every present in its temporal nudity tends toward the future and returns upon the past, or resumes that past, is prospection and retrospection. The despite oneself marks this life in its very living. Life is life despite life. In its patience and its aging, it is the living human corporeality as a possibility of pain, a sensibility which of itself is the susceptibility of being hurt, a self uncovered, exposed, and suffering in its skin. The passivity proper to patience, more passive thus than any passivity that is correlative to the voluntary, signifies the passive synthesis of its temporality. What happens when I tell a joke? This is the question that started my project. This paper begins with a simple gesture, a simple question. What happens when I tell a joke? or more specifically, what happens to me when I tell a joke. This paper attempts to get at what happens in the interval, the lapse between the telling of a joke and the reacting to a joke. In asking after this interval or lapse, it intends to inhabit the time between the joking and the laughing or the not laughing, to ask after the relation between myself and the other. Indeed, not all jokes get a laugh, and it is this not laughing, the groaning or the shuddering, that interests me most when it comes to telling jokes. I am most intrigued by the joke as an aesthetic object as well as an ethical object that does not garner a laugh, but leaves me exposed for some time, marks my exposure to the other's reaction. My simple question contains several additional questions. How does joking put us in relation? And how might we describe that relation? What affect does telling a joke have on me? What affect does it have on the other? How does it alter me? How does it alter the other? Before rushing to questions of laughter and concerns over the target of laughter, I want to linger a bit on the hither side of humor, holding my breath, so to speak, in the hiatus, delaying the moment of conclusion, not as a means of evading the issue, but in the hopes of regarding better this jocular opening. In his edifying discourses of 1843-44, Søren Kierkegaard discusses ethics and the nature of the good, silence and the joy of being human, and the relation between suffering and New Testament Christianity. In the discourses, he also addresses the question of the hazards of prayer with the following humorous parable. An ancient pagan who in pagandom was renowned and praised for his wisdom sailed on the same ship with a wicked man. When the ship was in distress, the wicked man lifted up his voice in prayer. But the wise man said to him, "Keep quiet, my friend. If heaven discovers you're on board, the ship will go under." Here, Kierkegaard traces the relations among a renowned pagan, a wicked man, and a ship in distress, in order to ask after the risks of lifting one's voice to heaven, and parabolically, after the pejorative disposition of heaven. We are never told why these men are on the seas together in the first place, neither are we told the nature of the distress they are experiencing. Most of all, we never learn the outcome of the perilous situation. We are left awaiting the conclusion of the story. We hear only the wise suggestion of patience and riding the storm out in silence to save all aboard the vessel. The stress is put on the voice and on being heard, for the implication is... My pages are different. The stress is put on the voice and on being heard, for the implication is that if heaven hears the man's voice, he and his wickedness will be recognized, putting all aboard the ship in assured jeopardy. The gravity of the man's wickedness appears to be heavy enough to sink everyone on board the ship. The wicked man, finding himself in peril, turns toward heaven. We do not hear his prayer, we never learn its contents. Perhaps he is confessing, or asking for mercy for the others on board. The prayer itself is not the concern here, though. The concern is over the affect and the effects of the prayer, its impression or influence, and the ramifications of that impression or influence. The wise man knows between the prayer and the answer, the situation will change. And the change evoked through the between time will make all the difference. This is the risk of prayer and the risk of jokes. They change things. Awaiting the outcome, we never learn if the wicked man takes the sage advice or not. The story is quite parabolic. What we are encountering in hearing this parable is the comic anti-hero, and the comic anti-hero paradigm Simon Critchley calls for in his work on jokes, laughter, humor, and the comedic. In Comedy and the Finitude, Displacing the Tragic Hero Paradigm in Philosophy and Psychoanalysis, Critchley suggests a philosophy of the comedic in response to the Antigone complex of post-Kantian philosophy so heavily invested in the tragic hero. After Kant and modernity's turn from religion to aesthetics, after the acknowledgement of the death of a certain god, Philosophy and psychoanalysis turn toward the tragic hero to fill the void. Most post-Kantian philosophical thought and Lacanian psychoanalysis, argues Critchley, becomes enamored with Antigone and her transgressive splendor as a model for the hero who will die for an authentic cause rather than live an inauthentic life. Critchley explains that this obsession with Antigone's death cannot be divorced from a certain androcentric philosophical idealization of the feminine as the divine victim. Antigone, like all tragic heroes, is seen as imbued with ability, authenticity, power, and the possibility of freely choosing her own death rather than live among the herd. The tragic hero overcomes the mundane by realizing her own being toward death. Against this paradigm, Critchley suggests a more modest, comic anti-hero, one that lingers in the bit of human life between birth and death, one based in the recognition not of the possibility of death, but of its impossibility. With Blanchot, Levinas, and some moments of Freud, Benjamin, and Kierkegaard, Critchley wants to laugh at the idea of grasping finitude and think through the model of an anti-hero with a palpable sense of inability, inauthenticity, impotence, and impossibility. The paradigm of humor, dark, sardonic, wicked humor, that connects people by highlighting the shared details of their daily lives. Like the wise pagan of Kierkegaard's parable, the comic anti-hero does not desire the transgressive splendor of the violent drive for truth, purification through a freely chosen death, nor the martyrdom of an authentically assumed faithfulness. Like the wise pagan, the comic anti-hero wants to stay in the boat a little while longer, tossed at sea, joking with the wicked man. This parable of the wise pagan and the paradigm of the comic anti-hero recall another story about impossibility, prayer, and a long wait. More than a mere digression, it reminds us that when it comes to jokes, as well as prayers, timing is everything. Perhaps there is some truth in Lester, played by Ellen Alda's claim in Crimes and Misdemeanors, that comedy is tragedy plus time. Tragedy plus time. Let us linger in these introductory remarks a little longer. A man was praying to God, "Lord, is it true that to you 1,000,000 years is only a second?" "Yes, that is true," replied God. I love jokes where God speaks, by the way. "Well then, what is $1,000,000 to you?" $1,000,000 is only a penny to me." "Ah, then Lord," said the man, "may I have a penny?" "Certainly," said God, "give me 1 second." Even God has a jocular, rather parabolic side. The lucidity of consolation. And I'm going to skip a good deal of this section because it's mostly a summary of Critchley's argument. In On Humor, Critchley reiterates his phenomenology of laughter and comedy, this time with more jokes and less Heidegger and Lacan. So when Critchley revises his own argument, he sort of pushes Heidegger and Lacan out of the way and gets more to the jokes themselves, to humor themselves. And he offers up his own argument more precisely in the book version. Again, he argues for the communal, transformative aspects of jokes, and especially the elevatory and liberatory potential of smiling, and this is the big change, smiling rather than laughing at jokes. And so this is Critchley's big move, to argue that in the original piece he argues that joking connects us, then it's kind of laughter, and then by the third permutation he argues that it's smiling. Not when you completely break into the laugh, but when you begin, that very tiny moment of just beginning to smile at a joke is important for Critchley. I'm going to skip the next 2 pages. For me, this is page 7. I don't know if I can catch you up very well or not, because I'm going to jump into the middle of a paragraph in the middle of something else.
What is the beginning of this paragraph?
Okay, it's after the Groucho Marx joke. I'm very sorry to cut Groucho, but...
Yes.
just after that, about 4 lines down from that. As Critchley explains. As we say in Singapore,
À peu
Cam?
près au premier tiers de... À peu près au premier tiers de la page d'après. As Critchley explains.
Okay, got it.
Okay. As Critchley explains, humor changes the situation in which we find ourselves, or lights up the everyday, providing an oblique phenomenology of ordinary life. Jokes show me the other side of things, prompt me toward other ways of looking at things I have come to take for granted, things I thought were only digressions. And in gaining a different angle or shot of something, in looking at them differently, I am opened to different points of viewing the situation. Jokes slow me down and speed me up. They displace me, and in doing so, they replace me. They show me a close-up of the world and provoke me to look at things I might have missed, including the things I may or may not like to see or appreciate. That's a summary of Critchley. I'm going to skip another page and a half. Just below, there's a block quote that ends with sensus communis.
Yes.
Okay? Right below that. In this light, one might begin to speak of laughter. See where I am? In this light, one might begin to speak of laughter as a minimal form of common sense. While jokes may gesture toward the comic anti-hero paradigm for thinking through the question of finitude, the end point of the matter lies with the outcome of the resolution of jokes. Laughter, it seems, is the frenetic medicine. While jokes parabolically open us to different points of view, laughter directly marks the shared experience of humor. Jokes may give us pause for thought, but laughter explodes on the scene, interrupts our hiatus, and presents the possibility of bringing us together with a new view of our ordinary practices. This coming to completion, though, reminds me of one of Lucy Ricardo's, played by Lucille Ball's, complaints from the I Love Lucy television show. Ever since we said, I do, there have been so many things we don't. There's a long history, I'm skipping another 2 pages, there's a long history of the relationship between laughing, orgasm, and crying. Large amount of phenomenology written about those 3. I'm skipping all of that summary to page 10. There's a block quote from Wanda Sykes that begins, I'm a black gay woman. I'm going to skip right below that. Jokes are jokes.
Yes.
Okay? Jokes are jokes precisely because they alter reality in unexpected ways that affect the other by calling her to respond. She may laugh or not laugh. Either way, jokes are relational because they expose myself and the other to the lived experience between us, precisely by exposing me to the other's response. Comedy cannot compel the other to a certain outcome, but because it calls for a response, most often an immediate response, it leaves me hanging, awaiting the other's reply. And I want to jump here to the other page, and I do apologize for all this leaping around. It had to do with the timing of getting things to Flora and things like that. But to the separate, you should have a separate sheet. And here I begin to leave Critchley and move toward Levinas. This is the... I've labeled these backwards. Okay, the second quote on the page, the comedy begins. This is from Emmanuel Levinas in Entre nous essays on thinking of the other. And this is one of the key passages for a lot of people thinking about Levinas and comedy, is the unintentionality involved, the unintentionality that links action and comedy. He says, the comedy begins with our simplest gestures. They all entail an inevitable awkwardness. Reaching out my hand to pull a chair toward me, I have folded the arm of my jacket. I have always loved this quote. Scratched the floor and dropped my cigarette ash. In doing what I willed to do, I did 1,001 things I hadn't willed to do. The act was not pure. I left traces. Wiping away these traces, I left others. Sherlock Holmes will apply his science to this irreducible coarseness of each of my initiatives, and thus the comedy may take a tragic turn. When the awkwardness of the act is turned against the goal pursued, we are in the midst of a tragedy. Laius, in attempting to thwart the fatal predictions, undertakes precisely what is necessary to fulfill them. Oedipus, in succeeding the worlds toward his own misfortune, in succeeding, I've messed up the quote somewhere there, it is like an animal fleeing in a straight line across the snow before the sound of the hunters, thus leaving the very traces that will lead to its death. And I think in some ways here, this is a passage that speaks very much to the argument, or to the idea of when you tell a joke and it falls flat. The unintentionality, or even when it doesn't fall flat. That's kind of my question here, is what does it mean for a joke to fail, for a joke to fall flat? Critchley's argument is that jokes bring us together. I want to ask about when the joke doesn't bring us together. What happens then? What happens in that moment? And this passage from Entre Nous speaks to this question, I think. Back to the paper. Comedy cannot compel the other to a certain outcome. I can't make you laugh. I think if there's one a priori of comedy, is that I cannot force you to laugh, no matter what else. I can force you to cry, I can force you to feel pain, I can force a lot of other responses. But laughter is the one thing you can't force on somebody. You can tickle somebody, but that's something different entirely. Comedy cannot compel the other to a certain outcome, but because it calls for a response, most often an immediate response, it leaves me hanging, awaiting the other's reply. At the finish of the passage above, Critchley repeats that even an apathetic or antagonistic person, one who does not laugh or refuses to laugh, only confirms the shared or intersubjective practice that is comedy. Jokes are jokes because they function between the teller and the audience, between the jokester and the listener, between myself and the other when I tell a joke, even if no one laughs. Yet as much as Critchley focuses on this common sense aspect of comedy, he moves from comedy to laughter in the process of doing so. In the middle of his discussion of the shared encounter of humor, he turns toward laughter as the privileged term. This is the history, this is a quick note here, this is the history of the study of comedy. Everybody who speaks about comedy conflates comedy and laughter. I haven't come across anybody who doesn't conflate the two. And so I'm trying to ask about, can we talk about comedy without talking about laughter? With so much else in play, the priority returns to the closure of the relationship, not the relationship itself, and to only one possible closure, laughter. In his essay on comedy, in his book on humor, Critchley moves from a focus on comedy or humor overall to this prioritizing of laughter. Here he reminds us, every comedian knows that a joke that does not get a laugh is not a joke. End of story. I take umbrage at that claim. And Critchley's not alone. Everybody makes this claim. Everybody conflates comedy and laughter. Earlier in the book, he writes, a true joke, a comedian's joke, suddenly and explosively, lets us see the familiar defamiliarized, the ordinary made extraordinary, and the real rendered surreal. And we laugh in a physiological squeal of transient delight, like an infant playing peekaboo. A true joke leads to laughter. That's the assumption. I wonder about this regime of laughter in light of the precarious situation of jokes at which no one laughs. Now this is the personal insertion moment. I tell a lot of jokes. They don't get laughs. This is kind of what motivates me to think about this so much. Is often I'm funny, often I'm not funny. Which one is better? That's my question. What of Lucille Ball's famous assertion, I'm not funny. What I am is brave. What of rape jokes? What of Holocaust humor? What of jokes that do not make you laugh? Might we need to slow down our consideration of jokes, especially jokes that fail? And I'm not sure what that means, but everybody else thinks it means jokes that nobody laughs at. And might slowing down help us think better the encounter of humor? This move from comedy to laughter, from the joke to the laugh, is perhaps the most common gesture in the history of writing about all things ludic. Since Plato and Aristotle, Western philosophy has conflated comedy and humor, or it might be more accurate to assert, has reduced comedy to laughter. The history of philosophy's engagement with comedy quickly becomes the history of its engagement with laughter as the affect of comedy. And I'm going to skip to the next page, this premature privileging of laughter. I just want to make a swerve into this. A good deal of this chapter is also about the gendered relationship to laughter, and who's allowed to laugh and who's not allowed to laugh. This premature privileging of laughter is even more interesting considered in the context of Anna Pavlushka's book, Laughter Notes on a Passion. Here, Pavlescu claims that all this talk of laughter, this is interesting. Everybody who talks about comedy talks about laughter. Then she comes in to argue, well, actually, they haven't even talked about laughter either. I don't know where this leaves us. All this talk about laughter with regard to humor, we have not actually taken laughter seriously. I'm going to skip to the next paragraph. By the final chapter of On Humor, Critchley too expresses his concerns over the turn to laughter. He will still concentrate on the end of the joke, the affect and the effects of comedy, but he will return to the time just before the laugh, the time that may stand still for an instant or may erupt into the laugh, the time of the smile. According to Critchley, when the laugh explodes and releases, for me it is the smile that is powerfully emblematic of the human, the quiet acknowledgement of one's limitedness. The smile, because it suspends, marks our very suspension between material and immaterial, between angels and beasts, between the here and now and the then and there, between melancholy and cheer. Okay, and then skip to affirmation, assent, acknowledgement, and alteration. The history of the philosophical encounter. The history of the philosophical encounter with comedy has been the history of writing about laughter. It has reduced the time of the joke, the diachrony of joking itself, into the laugh, and perhaps sometimes the laughing. And as Pavlescu cautions, it may not have taken even the laugh seriously enough. But still the question remains, the question with which I began the paper. What happens when I tell a joke? Or more specifically, what happens to me when I tell a joke? Let us proceed here through laughter once more to get back to this first question. In On Humor, Critchley writes of the shared intersubjectivity that lies at the foundation of all comedy. Things are laughable because we share something, and the joke has just recognizably rearranged that sharing through a magnifying of detail and an extending and compressing of time. Critically, it has bent reality, not broken it beyond all recognition. However, Critchley goes on to assert, if you do not laugh at my joke, then something has gone wrong either with my joke or with my telling of it. Either way, it was a mistake. I disagree completely. A true joke, a true humorous rearranging of a recognizably shared something results in laughter, according to Critchley. This social paradigm of the comic anti-hero is dependent upon the laughter, or at least the smile, at the end. But is it? Does a joke that fails to affect in a certain way, resulting in one or two effects only, not also function, and perhaps function even better, to mark our shared intersubjectivity? Or even more so, does not an unfunny joke mark even better our asymmetrical intersubjectivity? This is the minimal aspect of judgment I'm suggesting here. A return to joking and pausing again to consider what happens when I tell a joke, no matter the concluding effect its effect produces. For I'm interested in the effect of ludic affect. However, I want to consider better that affect in regard to not only smiling and laughing, but also groaning and shuddering, two other effects all too often produced, especially when I tell jokes, that may even mark more the asymmetrical intersubjective forces of humor. While Critchley's approach toward a comic anti-hero paradigm for philosophy and politics addresses the investment in affirmation, assent, agreement, and acknowledgement at play in jokes, it does not address the ethics of the encounter. If you do not laugh or at least smile at my joke, then we may not agree on something. We may not share the same worldview. It is this reassuring that we are us and we can relate through this mutually humorous event. This point is made painfully clear when the Office franchise brings together, are you all familiar with The Office? Okay. Oh, a British and American television show about a company going out of business, basically, with the worst boss ever. The Office franchise brings together the British and American leads, David Brent and Michael Scott, played by Steve Carell. Outside an elevator during one episode, the two men chat for a second about jokes others do not get, especially offensive humor. They're both very offensively humorous. And then David Brent says, "Comedy is a place where the mind goes to tickle itself." That's what she said. Michael Scott is speechless in recognition of a mirror image of himself and can only hug David Brent. Then the conversation turns to a lack of employment opportunities, it becomes awkward, and the men part company. As much as the comedic smile or laugh marks our social relations in regard to assent, agreement, or acknowledgement, it leaves underconsidered our relation to alteration, to the possibility of being altered by our encounter with the other who does not reflect our lived experience back to us. What if we take into account all humor, the good, the bad, and the ugly? What if there are no mistakes? What if a joke that does not get a laugh is still a joke? What if the laugh is not the object of our inquiry, but the joke itself? And what if the joke that does not end in a laugh is the more telling joke? For indeed, telling a joke that does not get a laugh tells us a good deal about telling jokes. Jokes that get a groan or a shudder do not close the circuit, do not resolve the time of the joke, but leave it painfully, affectively open. Jokes that affect a groan or a shudder, unfunny, unlaughable, offensive, and derisive jokes mark what we do not share, and they leave open the asymmetrical intersubjectivity of the interval or lapse of the joke, as well as leaving the jokester exposed to ridicule. And I want to go to this quote on the other handout, the first quote from Reality in Its Shadow. "In dying, the horizon of the future is given, but the future as a promise of a new present is refused. One is in the interval, forever an interval. It is as though death were never dead enough, as though parallel with the duration of the living ran the eternal duration of the interval, the meanwhile. Art brings about just this duration in the interval, in that sphere which a being is able to traverse, but in which its shadow is immobilized. The eternal duration of the interval in which a statue is immobilized differs radically from the eternity of the concept. It is the meanwhile, never finished, still enduring, something inhuman and monstrous. In a way, this is not in the paper. I'm just going to speak this here. In a way, my argument is that the joke that gets the laugh is much more related to the eternal concept that Levinas is describing here. And the joke that does not get the laugh is much more related to the eternal duration. The idea of terror, monstrosity, inhumanity. And I think this has major ramifications for how we read the relationship between these two phrases in Levinas, between these two concepts in Levinas, between the eternal concept and the eternal duration. I'm going to continue in the paper here. Critchley certainly also discusses this possibility of ridicule behind comedy and comes closest to describing the asymmetrical intersubjectivity when he writes, "We realize in an instant that the object of laughter is the subject who laughs." I want to follow this claim and hopefully arrive at a further ethical function of joking. If the object of laughter is the subject who laughs, then is the object of smiling the subject who smiles? What of the object of groaning? Is it the subject who groans? Is the object of shuddering not the subject who shudders? And finally, following this paradigm, is not the object of joking the subject who jokes? The object of joking? Yes. I would claim prior to the object of laughing, we must consider the object of joking, and that when we do so, we realize in an instant that the object of joking is the subject who jokes, the jokester. And the subject who jokes makes an object of herself, exposes herself to the ridicule of the other, pleads for the closure of a smile or laughter, fears the closure of a groan or a shudder, and is laid nude and bare by the closure that does not close, that is silence. No response is more hurtful, more terrifying to a jokester than silence. No response is more hurtful, more terrifying to a jokester than silence. The issue here, I propose, is not only the ego finding itself ridiculous, as Critchley describes happens when we learn to laugh at ourselves. This is the redeeming quality of humor for Critchley. A self-enclosed realization, but the other finding the self ridiculous, challenging the self's assuredness, the self-schema for encountering the everyday details of life. This opening toward the possibility of an altered phronesis or life practice is part of the point Emmanuel Levinas is making in the World of Phenomena and Expression section of Totality and Infinity. The ego finding itself ridiculous returns to itself, however. Quote, "It is only in approaching the other that I tend to myself. The face I welcome makes me pass from phenomena to being in another sense. In discourse, I expose myself to the questioning of the other. And this urgency of the response, the acuteness of the present, engenders me for responsibility. As responsible, I'm brought to my final reality. My exposure to the other alters me. We all know this. It opens me to the questioning of the other, and the very urgency of this opening engenders me for responsibility. Although Levinas never discusses joking as an act of exposure, the very urgency he describes is the effect of the joke on the jokester. Discourse, because it is an urgent plea for response, opens me to exposure, opens me to alteration, to change, to rearrangement. In a certain way, jokes are a plea for response, urgent response, that can be met with anything but silence. For, as Levinas says, silence is not a simple absence of speech. Speech lies in the depths of silence, like a laughter perfidiously held back. It is the universe of language. It is the inverse of language. The interlocutor has given a sign, but has declined every interpretation. This is the silence that terrifies. Silence terrifies the jokester not because it lacks anything, but because it marks the refusal of the invitation of exposure. When I tell a joke, I expose myself to the other, who can respond in any number of ways, some reaffirming, some frightening or challenging, and some terrorizing. All these responses mark the intersubjectivity of my human relations. Yet the latter responses are the ones that most stand to alter me, precisely by my most calling me into question, by calling my life practices and worldview into question. And the final one requires we further address asymmetrical intersubjectivity. What happens when I tell a joke? I ask to be affirmed, but I also risk being altered. Perhaps it is even possible to suggest that Critchley too sees this function of jokes as self-exposing, when in his earlier essay on comedy and finitude, and I'm going to skip that part because I'm tired of Critchley, except he mentions Levinas here, and he does see a connection to Levinas in this block quote here. But I want to get to one more joke before I wrap up, which reminds me of another parable about prayer, because I do want to get back to Kierkegaard where we started. A true believer is desperate, in desperate financial straits, prays to God to save him by letting him win the lottery. Days go by, then weeks, and then a month, but the man fails to win the lottery. Finally, in misery, he cries out to God, "Lord, you tell us, knock, and it shall be opened. Seek, and you shall find. I'm in deep trouble here, and I still haven't won the lottery." A voice from above answers, "Martin, you have to meet me halfway. Go buy a ticket." Despite oneself, neither comedy nor prayer offers escape. Both depend upon a passive patience, an opening to exposure and vulnerability that goes on. Both demand a certain interval, a certain lapse otherwise than oneself. I know a great knock-knock joke. Okay, tell me. All right, you start. Okay, knock-knock. Who's there? And if you've ever acted out this joke, you know how it goes. You flip the paradigm here. This exposure to risk, this risking being altered, then returns me to the question of prayer and the relation between prayer and jokes with which I began this essay. In Purity of Heart is to will one thing, from the Edifying Addresses, Kierkegaard writes, "The true explanation is therefore at the same time, the one must be desired. The prayer does not change God, but it changes the one who offers it. It is the same with the substance of what is spoken. Not God, but you, the maker of the confession, get to know something by your act of confession." Here the connection is made between prayers and parables, especially humorous ones. The function of prayer is not to influence God, but rather to influence the nature of the one who prays. Prayer alters the one who prays. Of course, for Levinas, it is precisely not to get to know something about God or myself that is at the heart of the matter. In praying, I run the fine risk of being altered. In joking, I run the fine risk of being altered. Praying and joking function analogously in terms of this dangerous life, changing the one who exposes herself. Whether God is dead or not, joking and praying function precisely because they function to alter the one who prays and the one who jokes. Even a silent God, who may well terrorize us, opens the possibility of change in our daily lives. And in closing, I would like to recall what Groucho Marx once said, "These are my principles. If you don't like them, I have others." Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brian. We have some time for one or two questions.
Thank you very much for your very exciting conference. It was for the first time that who relates Levinas and joke, and it was very interesting. And I have a question about the Levinas notion of third person, because you have focused on the relations between the subject who jokes and the other who listens this joke, and you didn't talk about the third person, but many jokes can be related to the third person who is not present, who is absent in the scene, and jokes can be related to this third person. We can laugh at someone who is not present, and I was wondering if you can develop something about this third person, perhaps because Levinas, in Levinas philosophy, it's also this third person who is.
We shared in your joke. The simple answer is no. I haven't thought about this. And the only response, because what I'm asking is only really about what happens to me when I tell a joke. I haven't gotten even to the other yet, really. I'm asking about what happens to me when I tell a joke. What am I demanding in telling that joke? And so the other plays a very passive role in what I'm questioning right now. As well, the third doesn't come into play, not yet anyway. The other thing that's interesting, there are people who write about the third, and they write about the third exactly in the way that you put it within your question. You said, what if the self and the other are laughing at the third? Oh, and the fly.
Not dangerous.
Again, the only thing I can say to this is that the folks I've read who are talking about the third are always talking about the third in terms of laughter. So they've also moved to laughter. They haven't stayed in comedy or humor as of yet. Sorry, that's the best I can give you. Thank you.
I would like to thank you about the item you decided to speak about. And I'm going to say something very short in French, because I'm sure you understand my French. C'est très étonnant, je dois remercier les organisateurs et vous d'avoir amené ce sujet, parce que cette question de la comédie et de l'humour comme problématique éthique, elle est très peu traitée. Et donc je dois juste dire un exemple pour soutenir votre idée. Mon travail consiste à faire des films documentaires. Et j'ai fait un film sur qu'est-ce qui fait rire les Français. Et je m'apprêtais à faire une série qu'est-ce qui fait rire les Anglais. Et en interrogeant des gens, ils m'ont dit nous avons arrêté de faire des blagues. Parce que si nous faisons des blagues sur des femmes, c'est humiliant. Si nous faisons des blagues sur les juifs, nous avons des problèmes. Si nous faisons des blagues sur les noirs, c'est encore pire. Et donc, ils m'ont envoyé chez des groupes qui sont des groupes de rire, dont l'origine vient d'Inde, du yoga, mais qui sont des clubs de rire, où ils rient sans que quoi que ce soit ne soit dit. C'est-à-dire que le travail qui est fait est de créer du rire, et j'en ai vu, j'ai flippé, c'est assez pénible et émouvant et très curieux, car ils se font rire mutuellement, mais il n'y a aucun mot prononcé. Et c'est pour éviter que tout le système relationnel que crée ou que ne crée pas avec les blagues qui échouent, le fait de dire des blagues ou de mettre en situation de comédie ne provoque un effet destructeur. Et donc on élimine le langage, et on élimine la relation, et on garde le rire.
We just keep the laughing and we give away the joke, the words and everything. It's an amazing experience, he reports. This kind of goes. Do you want to react?
Yeah, tiny bit. Yeah. I'd like to see this film. Does it have French subtitles? I can read French decently. It's I can't hear anything. I can barely hear English. So that film again, I think, is a perfect example of reducing comedy to laughter. It immediately, I mean, the film is the perfect example. Erasing the jokes and moving right to the laughter is exactly what the history of philosophy has been. Philosophy has not been able to actually address comedy. It always leaps to laughter, or it avoids the topic completely. So I love this idea of just moving straight to the laughter. It's a perfect example. Yeah. Not George. No.
Not Georgie?
No.
No, not you. Peut-être qu'on fera les deux questions en même temps, et puis ce sera les deux dernières. Et juste après, voilà, si on peut faire les deux.
I would like to know how you understand the narrative I shall tell you. In fact, it's a joke about a joke, which was not a joke. And perhaps it will finish with a joke.
Perfect.
It's I was in United States at the airport, and when to go out of the town and to another town, I was at the desk, and the lady asked me, "Have you weapons in your luggage?" I could think it was a joke, so I answered, "No, just a bomb." I saw the face of the attendant, who was livid. So immediately I told her, "No, it's not a joke." No, sorry. I told her, "Oh, I just was joking." And she told me, "No, it's not a joke, sir." Sir, 5 minutes after, I was between two big guys of the FBI. And they asked me, "Do you permit me to open your luggage?" I thought it was a joke, but I didn't want to continue the joking, so I was very serious. "Yes, I permit you." And they opened my luggage. Afterwards, they kept me, and I missed my plane. It's not a very good thing, but and now I can tell you this. Oh, I have to finish with something you can take as a joke or not. I give you an advice not to give some joking answer when you are at the desk of the airport. Now, my question is, how would you interpret my joke or not joking in your framework?
Est-ce que peut-être juste la dernière question? Voilà, oui, allez-y, juste une dernière question. You can answer to both questions in the same time.
It's still the long way before the church, had said once Cardinal Sujet. But I suppose the life is not comedy, it is reality. But the phrase of this text, comedy cannot compel the others. Compel the others to a certain outcome, but because it calls for a response. But my argument, the comedy calls for the reality, calls for choices, for the and the life is a journey to the internal values. But the life is the calls for a response to the people of contemporary. This is the very expensive response of our values, of our choices.
Oui. And
And now your challenge is to answer to both questions within less than 2 minutes.
Okay.
Try a joke.
Yeah. First of all, Georges, I liked the way you mistold the story the first time. When she said to you, or now I'm forgetting the order that you told it in, that you saw her reaction, and her reaction was livid. And you said, "This is not a joke." Compounding the idea, I actually like that reaction, that if it hadn't been a joke in the first place, you wouldn't have been in so much trouble with the whole thing. The other part of this is that I appreciate the motto or the announcement that comes through the airport, that we take all joking seriously. I'm doing the same thing. I'm taking all joking seriously from a Levinasian standpoint. And what happens with this joking when we take it seriously. As far as your example sort of represents what Critchley is talking about and sort of doesn't. It represents what Critchley is talking about in the standpoint that the joking opened this space for shared relationship, right? You thought it was absurd to ask, do you have any weapons in your luggage? And so you made a joke in response to this, saying, of course you're not going to think that I have any weapons in my luggage, right? It's the of course that generates this sociality, the shared subjectivity of the of course. This is why we can joke about this. And then they didn't take it as a joke. They took it seriously. And so it went from this shared sociality to what I think Critchley would say is the political ramifications of joking, right? Your joke showed, I don't share your worldview. And then you found two men standing beside you who want to look through your luggage. So I think that your story represents a lot of what Critchley's talking about very, very well. That your attempt to joke was an attempt to share in a worldview. And what happened was the opposite of that. It opened this space, but still within political ramifications. I guess the question I might ask you in response is, did you feel shame, or did you feel exposure, or did you suffer at the moment that you made your joke and she didn't laugh at the joke? Or did you mostly just feel, oh damn? I've forgotten the second.
About simultaneously, about our choices, about, for example, the beautiful title, Here I Am Exposed and Suffering the Interval, but we must choose, we must for example, we must go in the jungle of the values of the contemporary choices of the people. And the relation among this and the choices, of our choices, is very important on my arm.
Yeah, I won't disagree with that, and I'll go very, very quickly. It's not my choice. I mean, I choose whether or not to tell the joke. That's not my argument, most of the time. I'm such a jokester that a joke comes out before I realize it came out, and then I'm in trouble. This happens often. The thing is, no matter what I intend as a jokester, I can't control your response to that joke. I mean, I could aim right now. I could tell you the most racist, terrible joke you'd ever heard in your life. You could laugh or not.
Yeah.
That's the point where the interval happens. I can choose to tell the joke most of the time, but I cannot choose to make you laugh. And that's the difference for me. Thank you.
Thank you. Merci beaucoup. On va clôturer cette première séance. Vous pouvez applaudir les deux orateurs. Le rendez-vous est à 4.